A follower who works as a night watchman in a municipal cemetery sent me this experience a few days ago. His name is Roberto, and what he experienced during his rounds made him question everything he believed about death. If you work at night in lonely places and have seen things you can't explain, I would love for you to share below. Now let me tell you what Roberto discovered on the darkest nights among the graves. My name is Roberto and I work as a night watchman at the San Miguel Municipal Cemetery on the outskirts of Montevideo, Uruguay. I have been in this job for 12 years, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had seen it all. Drunks sneaking into sleep among the graves, teenagers playing pranks, occasional acts of vandalism. Nothing I couldn't handle with a call to the police. But what began to happen last March completely changed my perspective on what I really watch over each night. San Miguel Cemetery is one of the oldest in the city. It was founded in 1835, and some of its graves are historical monuments. It covers approximately 10 hectares, with marble mausoleums, family crypts, and more modest sections where ordinary people rest. During the day, it is a quiet place where families visit their deceased. But at night, when the gates close and only I remain with my flashlight, the cemetery transforms into something completely different. I work the shift from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. My routine is simple. I make rounds every hour, check that the gates are closed, that there are no intruders, that branches haven't fallen on the graves. Between rounds, I sit in the watchtower at the main entrance, where I have a small television, a coffee maker, and a heater for the cold winters. I have seen strange things over the years. Lights that seem to move among the graves but disappear when I get closer. Sounds that I can't fully explain. Whispers when there is no wind. Footsteps on gravel when I am alone. But I always found ways to rationalize it. The lights were reflections of cars on the nearby street. The sounds were nocturnal animals or the settling of old structures. Until the night of March 15th. It was a Friday, and it had been raining all afternoon. The air was cool and damp, with that low mist that makes everything look blurry and distant. I started my shift as usual, checking the perimeter, making sure all the side doors were locked. Around midnight, during my third round, I noticed something unusual. In the oldest section of the cemetery, where the 19th century graves are, there was a light. It wasn't the kind of light I had seen before, a fleeting reflection I could attribute to car headlights. This was constant, soft, like the light of a candle, emanating from one of the largest mausoleums. I approached, with my flashlight held high. The mausoleum belonged to the Ortega family, one of the founding families of Montevideo. It was an imposing structure of white marble with columns and a wrought iron door, and that door, which had always been locked with a rusty padlock, was ajar. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, expecting to find vandals or vagrants. There was no response. The light continued to flicker softly from within. I pushed the door, which opened with a prolonged creak. Inside, the mausoleum was larger than I expected. It could hold maybe 20 coffins, arranged in niches in the walls. And in the center of the space, on the marble floor, there were 3 lit black candles, forming a perfect triangle. In the center of the triangle, there were symbols drawn with something that looked like ash or charcoal. They were not random scribbles. They were deliberate, precise, and although I had no idea what they meant, they made me feel deeply uncomfortable. Someone had been here. Someone had performed some kind of ritual. I carefully extinguished the candles, swept the symbols with my boot, and closed the mausoleum, making sure the lock was firmly in place this time. I reported the incident in my night log. Possible vandal activity at the Ortega mausoleum. Strange symbols found. Area secured. I thought that would be the end of the matter, but I was wrong. 2 nights later, a Sunday, I found the same mausoleum open again. And once again, the 3 black candles, the triangle, the symbols on the ground. But this time there was something else. A small doll, made of dry branches tied with red string, placed in the exact center of the triangle. A chill ran down my spine. This was not the work of bored teenagers. It was something more deliberate, more serious. Someone was using the cemetery to practice some kind of witchcraft or dark ritual. I called the police. 2 officers arrived an hour later, inspected the mausoleum, took photographs, and confiscated the doll as evidence. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but we both knew that with the department's limited resources, that meant maybe 1 additional visit per week. "Do you have any idea who could be doing this?" one of the officers asked me. "I haven't seen anyone. I make rounds every hour, I don't know how they get in without me seeing them. The officers left, and I continued my shift, but I could no longer relax. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every sound put me on alert. Over the next 2 weeks, the mausoleum was violated 4 more times, and each time, the ritual seemed to become more elaborate. More candles, more complex symbols, strange objects left behind, small animal bones, jars with dark liquids, burned photographs of people I didn't recognize. I installed a security camera pointing directly at the Ortega mausoleum. If anyone approached, we would capture it on video. The first night with the camera, I reviewed the recording the next morning, and what I saw left me frozen. At 3:17 in the morning, the door of the mausoleum opened, but no one opened it. It simply opened by itself, slowly moving outward. Then, for about 15 minutes, the camera showed only the dark entrance of the mausoleum. No one visible entered or exited. But when I went to physically check the mausoleum that morning, there they were. The candles, the symbols, everything perfectly set up as in previous times. How was that possible? The camera had recorded continuously. No one had entered, and yet someone or something had performed the ritual. I showed the recording to my supervisor, hoping he might have an explanation. He watched it in silence, his expression growing more serious. "Roberto, I need to tell you something about that mausoleum," he finally said. "Something that few know." He took me to his office and pulled out an old file from a drawer. It contained cemetery documents dating back decades. In 1952, there was an incident at the Ortega mausoleum. A woman named Iris Vidal was found dead inside. She had performed some kind of suicidal ritual, poisoning herself while surrounded by candles and symbols. She left a note saying that she had made a pact with something she called the guardian of the thresholds, and that her death was just the beginning of that pact. What kind of pact? The note was delirious, full of nonsensical words, but the coherent part said that she would open a path between the world of the living and the dead, that every new moon she would return to complete her work. Obviously, the authorities dismissed it as the ramblings of a mentally ill woman. But what? Every so often over the years, night watchmen have reported strange activity in that mausoleum, always around the new moon, and always the same pattern. Candles, symbols, ritual objects. Some watchmen quit because of it, others simply stopped reporting it. Why did no one do anything? My supervisor shrugged. What could they do? There's no evidence that anyone is entering. There's no real damage. It's easier to ignore it than to try to explain it. But I couldn't ignore it. Not now that I knew the story, and definitely not after what happened that very night. It was a new moon. I knew something would happen, so I decided to stay awake all night, watching the mausoleum from a safe distance, hidden behind a large tree with a clear view of the entrance. The hours passed slowly. Midnight, 1 in the morning, 2. At 3 in the morning, just as the recording had shown, the door of the mausoleum began to open, slowly, without anyone touching it, as if an invisible hand was pushing it. I forced myself to remain hidden, watching. The mist had grown thicker, swirling around the mausoleum in a way that seemed almost alive. And then I saw her. A figure emerged from the mausoleum. It was a woman, dressed in vintage clothing from the 50s. A dark dress, low-heeled shoes, hair pulled back in a bun. She walked with deliberate steps, as if she were in a trance. She was carrying a bag from which she took out the black candles, the jars, all the implements of the ritual. She meticulously arranged them on the floor of the mausoleum, working with the skill of someone who has done this thousands of times. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This woman seemed solid, real, but she had emerged from a sealed mausoleum, filled with coffins of people who had died decades ago. How was that possible? I took out my cell phone trying to record, but as soon as I pointed the camera at her, the screen filled with static. The phone completely shut down, as if the battery had instantly drained. The woman finished preparing her ritual. She knelt in the center of the triangle of candles and began to sing. I couldn't clearly hear the words from my hiding place, but the sound was unsettling, a monotonous melody in a language I didn't recognize. As I sang, something began to change in the air. The temperature dropped abruptly, my breath became visible, and the mist started to move in ways that normal fog shouldn't move. It swirled, condensed, taking on almost humanoid shapes. There were figures in the fog, dozens of them, spectral shapes materializing at the edges of the cemetery, slowly moving towards the mausoleum, drawn by the woman singing. They were the dead, the spirits of those buried here, and she was summoning them. Terror paralyzed me. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to get out of the cemetery and never return. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching this impossibility unfold before me. The spectral figures surrounded the mausoleum, forming a circle. The woman raised her arms, her singing reaching a crescendo. And then, in the exact center of her triangle of candles, something began to materialize. It was a crack in the air. There is no better way to describe it, as if space itself were tearing, revealing something behind. A darkness deeper than any normal blackness, a darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. From that crack emerged things. They were neither human nor animal. They were twisted, impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly, tentacles of shadow, eyes that shone with sickly light, mouths full of teeth that should not exist. The woman spoke with these things in that strange language. She seemed to be negotiating, offering something in exchange for something else. The spirits of the dead watched silently, witnesses to this profane exchange. Then, without warning, the woman turned her head directly towards my hiding place. Our eyes met through the mist and darkness. She shouldn't have been able to see me. I was perfectly concealed, in the shadows, motionless. But she saw me. She smiled. And that smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. It was neither malicious nor cruel. It was empty, emotionless, like the smile of a doll or a mask. He raised a hand, pointing at me. The things that had emerged from the crack turned towards me. The spirits of the dead turned towards me. All at once, they began to move in my direction. That was the moment my paralysis broke. I ran. I ran faster than I had run in years, stumbling over roots and gravestones, not caring about the direction as long as it was away from that mausoleum and the things coming towards me. I could feel them behind me. I didn't hear footsteps but a collective whisper, like 1,000 voices speaking at the same time. The air around me turned icy. My lungs burned with every breath. I reached the guard booth, threw myself inside and locked the door. The booth's windows had metal bars, installed years ago for protection against vandals. I had never been so grateful for those bars. Things arrived moments later. I saw them pressing against the windows, dark and twisted shapes blocking the street light. The spirits of the dead floated around the booth, their spectral faces looking inward with expressions of pleading or warning. It was hard to tell. And among them, walking calmly toward the booth's door, was the woman. Iris Vidal, the one who had died in 1952, the one who had made a pact with something dark and had promised to return every new moon. He stopped in front of the door. Through the reinforced glass, he could see her clearly. Her skin was pale, almost transparent. Her eyes were black, completely black, with no visible white. And when she spoke, her voice penetrated through the door as if there were no barrier. "Watcher," she said. Her voice was multiple, as if many people were speaking simultaneously. "You have seen what you should not have seen. You have interrupted the sacred work." "I didn't want to. I'm just doing my job," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Your job is to watch over the dead, but you do not understand what that really means. The dead do not rest peacefully in their graves. They are trapped, prisoners between worlds, suffering in silence. I offer them release. I open the door so they can finally cross." "Where do they cross to?" Her smile widened. "To where we all must eventually go. To the other side of the veil. To the realm of the guardian of the thresholds." "And those things? The monsters that came with you?" "They are not monsters. They are the guardians of the path. They ensure that only the truly dead can cross. The living must remain here unless they voluntarily choose to make the journey." "Are you offering me a choice?" "Everyone has a choice, Watcher. You can forget what you saw tonight. You can go on with your life, ignorant of the deeper truths. Or you can join me in my work. You can help free the trapped dead. You can serve the guardian." "And what if I refuse both options?" The smile vanished from her face. "Then you will become a problem that must be resolved." The things in the windows began to press harder. The glass creaked under the pressure. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. "I have until dawn to decide," I said, trying to buy time. Iris Vidal tilted her head, considering. "Until dawn then, but choose wisely, Watcher. Your soul is at stake." She and the things withdrew, fading into the mist. The spirits of the dead lingered a moment longer, looking at me with what seemed to be pity, before also disappearing. I stayed in the guardhouse, trembling, waiting for dawn. It was the longest wait of my life. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to be them returning. When the sun finally rose, the first light of day swept over the cemetery. Everything seemed normal again, calm, peaceful, as if the nightmare of the previous night had never happened. But when I went to the Ortega mausoleum, I found evidence that it had indeed occurred. The candles were there, burned down to the stubs. The symbols were drawn, and in the center of the triangle, there was a message written in ash. Until the next new moon, choose. I quit that very morning. I told my supervisor that I had health issues, that I needed a less stressful job. He didn't ask questions. I think he knew. But resigning did not end my problems. Because every new moon since then, no matter where I am, I feel its presence. Sometimes I see it in the corners of my vision, watching me from the shadows, reminding me that I still haven't made my choice. I have researched everything I can about Iris Vidal. She was an ordinary woman before her death. She worked as a secretary, lived alone, and had no family. The police records of her death mention that she had been studying occult texts in the months leading up to her suicide, particularly about something called the Guardians of the Thresholds, entities supposedly responsible for guiding souls between life and death. I found her grave in the cemetery. It is in the oldest section, a simple headstone with just her name and dates. I left flowers there. I'm not sure why. Maybe I thought that if I showed respect, she would leave me in peace. It didn't work. The last new moon, 3 days ago, she appeared in my apartment. She didn't break the door or the window. She was just there when I woke up at 3 in the morning, sitting in the chair next to my bed. "The time is running out, Roberto," she said, using my name for the first time. "You have avoided the decision for 6 months, but you can't avoid it forever. On the next new moon, you either join me, or I take your soul anyway. Those are your only options now." Why me? Why not just continue your ritual and leave me alone? Because you saw. Because you know. I can't allow that knowledge to exist without consequence. Either you become part of the work, or you become part of the payment. She disappeared after that, leaving me alone in the darkness, my heart pounding wildly. I have considered going to the police, to the church, to anyone who can help. But what would I tell them? That I am being haunted by the ghost of a woman who died in 1952? That every new moon opens a door between worlds in a cemetery in Montevideo? They would lock me up in a psychiatric hospital. I have considered fleeing, moving to another city, another country, but I know it would be of no use. Iris Vidal has waited more than 70 years to fulfill her pact. She is not going to let something as simple as distance stop her. So here I am, sharing this story, waiting for the next new moon that arrives in 5 days. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if there is really a choice, or if my fate was sealed the night I decided to hide and observe instead of fleeing. Part of me, a small dark part, is curious. What is really on the other side of the veil? Is it worse than this life of constant fear? Do the dead really suffer in their graves as Iris claims, or is it just a justification for her dark pact? But most of me is terrified. I don't want to die. I don't want to serve incomprehensible entities. I just want all of this to end, to be able to return to a normal life where the only thing I had to worry about was catching vandals and securing doors. I have started carrying protection symbols with me. A crucifix that belonged to my grandmother, salt in my pockets, an amulet I bought from a seller of esoteric items who probably thinks I'm a lunatic. I don't know if they do any good, but they make me feel slightly less vulnerable. I have also been documenting everything. I have written down every detail of my encounters with Iris Vidal. I have drawn the symbols she uses in her rituals. I have recorded the exact dates of each new moon. If something happens to me, at least there will be a record. And now, sharing this here, there is a public testimony. Maybe that offers some protection. Or maybe it just serves as my final confession before the next new moon arrives and I have to face my choice. I don't know what I will do when that moment arrives. I don't know if I will have the courage to refuse and face the consequences, or if my survival instinct will lead me to accept their offer and become part of something dark and unnatural. The only thing I know for sure is that in 5 days, when the moon disappears from the sky again, I will discover my answer. And whatever my decision may be, my life as I knew it has already ended. There is no turning back from what I have seen, from what I know. The dead do not rest in peace. There are doors between worlds that some open, and watching over a cemetery means much more than just protecting graves from vandals. It means being on the edge of realities that most people will never know. I wish I had remained ignorant. I wish I had never investigated those candles in the Ortega mausoleum. I wish I had quit the first night something seemed strange to me. But I didn't. And now I live with the consequences of my curiosity. That is the story that Roberto sent me. He contacted me 3 days ago, just before the new moon he mentions. I haven't heard from him since then. I've tried calling him, writing to him, but he doesn't respond. I don't know if he made his choice, or if the choice was made for him. If anyone knows the San Miguel Municipal Cemetery in Montevideo, or if you have worked there, let me know in the comments. Maybe someone else knows what happened to Roberto. Take care, and rest easy tonight. I want to share the testimony of a listener who signs as Rodrigo from Peru. He wrote to me that this happened to him when he was 19 years old, during a vacation in the town where his mother was born. He told me that for years he tried to forget it, and that writing it down was the first time he put it into complete words. If you have something similar that you have been carrying alone, you know that there is space here to share it. This is what Rodrigo experienced the summer he met the man on the road. He was 19 years old, and was one of those people who are not afraid of anything because they have not yet seen enough. I say this without pride. It is simply what he was. He was studying his first year of engineering, living in Lima, and had that unfounded confidence that comes from not having yet encountered something that takes it away. My friends told me I was reckless. My mother told me I was imprudent. I thought both of them were wrong. That summer I went to spend 3 weeks in Huayco Viejo, which is what I will call the town where my mother was born, and where relatives still lived whom I barely knew, because the move to Lima had happened when she was very young, and the ties to that place had been maintained, but from a distance. It was my mother who suggested the trip to me. She said she wanted me to know where the family came from, that the relatives were asking about me, that the mountain air would do me good after a year, locked up in the city. I went with the attitude of someone doing a favor. I arrived by bus, a long journey that ended in a small town perched on a hillside over 3,000 meters high. The adobe houses, the dirt streets, the dry cold of the altitude that no city coat is really prepared to face. My Aunt Graciela, my mother's sister, was waiting for me in the square, with that particular warmth of people who live far from the city and who truly welcome visitors without reservations. The first few days were calm. I got used to the cold, to the altitude that initially left me breathless when climbing any slope, to the different schedules, to the silence of the nights that never exists in Lima. I liked the relatives. The food was good. The landscape was one of those that makes you understand why people stay in certain places. It was on the 4th day that I heard about the path through the ravine. I was in my Aunt Graciela's kitchen when 2 neighbors who had come to visit her mentioned that they had seen someone walking along that path the night before, late, when no one should be there. The 2 women spoke in low voices, with that particular seriousness that people have when describing things that truly concern them. "What path is that?" I asked. The 2 women looked at me. My Aunt Graciela looked at me too. "The one that goes down through the ravine towards the river," my aunt said. "But you have no business being there." "Why?" "Because at night, that path is not for walking," said one of the neighbors, a lady named Doña Carmen, who had the permanent expression of someone who has seen too many bad things and would prefer not to see any more. "What's wrong with it?" Doña Carmen looked at me with that patience that older people have when they explain something to a young person they know won't fully understand. "There's a man who walks that path at night," she said. "For many years now. No one knows exactly how long. The old folks in the village know him. His parents knew him. He has always been there." "A man? A real man?" "That's what it seems," said Doña Carmen. "Until you get closer." I asked her what she meant by that. My Aunt Graciela placed a cup of tea in front of me with more force than necessary. "Rodrigo," she said, "there are things in this town that belong to this town and that people from outside don't understand. Not because they are silly, but because they haven't grown up with them. I ask you to listen and not to go to the ravine road at night." I changed the subject. But I kept the information. That night, lying in the room that had been assigned to me, with the cold from the mountain seeping through the window and the complete silence of the sleeping town, I thought about the man on the road, in that way that warnings that are not well explained settle in the mind of someone 19 years old, who has not yet learned that there are warnings that deserve to be obeyed, without fully understanding why. The next day I asked my cousin Sebastian, who was my age and had grown up in the town, about the ravine road. Sebastian was different from me, quieter, more careful, with that particular relationship with the environment that people who grew up in places where nature is close have, and where ancient stories are part of the landscape as much as the hills. "Did they tell you about the walker?" he said. "Your mom's neighbors. Have you seen him?" Sebastian looked at me. "Once," he said. "When I was about 15, I went with some friends to the path at night, trying to be brave. We saw him from afar. And we ran away," he said, without any drama, as if that were the only reasonable answer. "We didn't go back." "What exactly did you see?" Sebastian took a while to respond. "A man walking along the path, in the direction of the river, from behind. The thing is, the path in that stretch goes straight, without curves, and we were looking at him from above, from where the path bends. We watched for a while. The man was walking. He kept walking, and he wasn't getting any closer." "Did he not advance?" "He walked and walked but did not get anywhere, as if the path beneath him was moving backward." Sebastian paused. "After a while, he stopped walking and stood still, and slowly he turned. Not completely, just enough for us to know that he knew we were there, and at that moment we left. That should have been enough for me. It wasn't. That night, when the house was already asleep and the village was completely silent, I put on my coat, took the small flashlight I carried in my backpack, and went out. The path of the ravine was easy to find. It came out from the southern end of the village and descended the slope following the edge of the ravine, among boulders and low bushes that during the day looked ordinary, and that at night, with only the light of the moon, had elongated shadows and ambiguous shapes of the nocturnal vegetation. I walked for about 20 minutes. The cold was more intense outside the village, with the wind coming down from the hill, smelling of earth and something mineral that I couldn't identify. The flashlight illuminated the path in front of me but created a denser darkness at the edges, that tunnel effect that makes any lateral movement seem more threatening than it is. I didn't see anything during the first 20 minutes. The path was just the path. The ravine to my right was more of a sound than an image, the water flowing below, invisible in the darkness. Then I saw the man. He was ahead on the path, about 50 meters away, with his back to me. He was an average-sized figure, dressed in dark clothing, walking in the direction of the river as Sebastian had described. He walked with the slightly hunched posture of someone older or someone tired. I stopped. I watched him. He was walking. He kept walking. And after a minute, I understood what Sebastian had tried to describe to me. The man was advancing his steps, but the distance between him and me did not change. He remained 50 meters away, 50 meters, even though his legs were moving regularly. I turned off the flashlight. In the darkness, with only the light of the moon, the figure was more visible than I expected. There was something about it that absorbed the light differently from the surroundings, a visual density that made it stand out against the background of the dark path. The man stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had stopped. The sound of the water from the stream had also disappeared, or I had stopped hearing it. I don't know exactly which of the two things it was. The figure began to turn, slowly, with that deliberate slowness that movements have when they want to be seen. He did not turn completely, just like Sebastian had experienced. He turned enough to show the profile. In the moonlight, the profile was not that of a person. I am not going to describe in detail what I saw, because there are images that describing them too precisely gives them a permanence that I prefer they do not have. What I can say is that the angle of the face did not correspond to the angle of a human face, that the proportions were slightly off in a way that the eye detects before the mind, that there was something in that profile that the brain recognizes as a warning before you can articulate exactly why. I turned around and walked back to the village. I did not run. I know it sounds strange, but at that moment running felt like the wrong option, as if running were a signal, a reaction that something was waiting for. I walked quickly with the flashlight off because turning it on felt worse, using the moonlight to keep me on the path. I did not look back. At some point, when I should have been about 10 minutes from the village, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the steps of someone running to catch up with me, the steps of someone walking at the same pace as me, exactly at the same pace, as if my step were the model and the steps behind were the copy. I kept walking. The steps continued. When I reached the edge of the village, where the first adobe houses marked the end of the road and the beginning of the inhabited space, the steps stopped. I did not stop. I continued to my Aunt Graciela's house, entered, closed the door, and stood in the dark kitchen for a time I did not measure, listening to the silence of the village. There was nothing else that night. The next morning at breakfast, my Aunt Graciela looked at me in a way that told me she knew I had gone out. She didn't say anything at that moment. She waited for Sebastian to go to school and for the other relatives to disperse into their activities, and then she sat down in front of me with a cup of coffee and looked at me with the expression of someone who has something to say and has been waiting for the right moment. "Did you see him?" she said. "Yes." "Did he follow you?" "I heard footsteps to the edge of the village." My Aunt Graciela nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something. "What is it?" I asked her. She held the cup with both hands and looked at the coffee before responding. "No one knows for sure," she said. "The old people in the village have different versions. Some say it's someone who died on that road a long time ago and hasn't been able to leave. Others say it was never a person, that it's something that has always been in that ravine, something that existed before the village. There are those who say that in earlier times, the people here had dealings with what lives in certain places, that in exchange for things they gave something, and that what you see on that road is the reminder of one of those dealings." "What kind of dealings?" "The kind that it's better not to know too much about," my aunt said. "What everyone here does know is that there are rules. Not going to the road at night is the main one. As long as no one seeks it out, nothing happens. The problem is when someone seeks it out." "What happens when someone seeks it out?" My aunt looked directly at me. "It depends on how close you get," she said, "and whether it recognizes you." "What does it mean for it to recognize you?" "It means that from that moment on, he knows who you are," he said. "That you don't have to go down the path for him to know where you are." The cold I felt at that moment was not from the weather. "What do I do now?" My aunt got up and went to the kitchen cupboard. She took something from a high shelf, a small bundle of plants tied with red thread, the kind I had seen hanging in some houses in the village without asking what they were for. He placed it on the table in front of me. "You take it with you," he said. "Don't leave it in a drawer or in your backpack, on your body, close, and while you're here, don't go out at night alone." "What about when I go to Lima?" My aunt looked at me with an expression that mixed worry and something like resignation. "In Lima, there is distance," she said. "Distance helps, but it's not a guarantee. I spent the rest of the vacation in the village without going out at night. I sewed the bundle of plants inside the lining of my coat, as my aunt had instructed me. I didn't see the man on the road again, but 3 nights before I left, between sleep and wakefulness, in that state where the mind is half asleep and half aware, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window, footsteps that walked without going anywhere, at the same rhythm as those on the road. I stayed still with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling until it stopped. I don't know how long it took. When dawn broke, I went out to look at the ground outside the window. There were no footprints. I returned to Lima at the end of the 3 weeks. I kept the bundle of plants in the drawer of the nightstand, not in the lining of the coat as my aunt had told me, because in Lima, it seemed excessive to me, too great a concession to something that I wanted to convince myself was not completely real. That night I dreamed of the path of the ravine, of the figure with its back turned that did not move forward, of the profile that slowly turned under the moonlight. The next morning I took the bundle out of the drawer and tucked it into my pants pocket. I still carry it. Not in the pocket anymore though, because after 2 years it fell apart. My Aunt Graciela sent me another one by mail, without me asking for it, with a brief note that said, "I know the previous one no longer works. Take care. I haven't dreamed of the path again since I got the new one. Or at least I don't remember dreaming of it, which is not exactly the same." So far, this is Rodrigo's testimony. He told me when he sent it that he doesn't know if what he saw that night was what the old folks in the village describe or something different, and that he has stopped needing to know. I think that's wisdom. If you've ever visited a place where the local rules made more sense than you wanted to admit, tell me about it in the comments. And if this story kept you company while you rested, subscribe to keep hearing more each week. Good night. We'll talk again next time. I received this message from a listener named Sofia from Spain. She wrote to me that what she is going to tell happened to her 7 years ago, that she has told very few people, and that most of them did not believe her. Before I start, if you have something similar stored away and want me to narrate it, write to me. Reading those messages is what makes this channel possible. Now let me tell you what happened to Sofia the night her little daughter started talking to someone who didn't exist. My daughter Lucia was 4 years old when she started talking to the boy in the corner. That's what she called him, with that disarming naturalness that small children have to say things that paralyze adults. Lucia mentioned him one night during dinner, without preamble, while eating her soup. The boy in the corner says he doesn't like it when you turn off the light. My husband Ernesto and I looked at each other across the table. "What boy, dear?" I asked her. I asked. "The one in the corner of my room," she said, as if it were obvious. "The one that is there at night." Ernesto and I were one of those couples that read about child development. We knew that imaginary friends are completely normal in children of that age, that the developing brain builds companions and relationships that serve real psychological functions. We were not alarmed. We went along with it with the calmness of informed parents. "And what is the boy like?" Ernesto asked. Lucia thought for a moment. "Sad," she said. "He is always sad. We lived in an apartment in a medium-sized city in northern Spain. Ernesto worked as an engineer in a construction company, and I had been on leave for 4 years taking care of Lucia, intending to return to work in accounting when she started school. It was an orderly and quiet life. We had had the apartment for 2 years, having bought it second-hand from a family that was moving to another city, and we had never had any problems with it." The boy in the corner became part of the conversational landscape for Lucia during the following weeks. She mentioned him frequently, always in a sideways manner, as if referring to something she took for granted, that the boy had been there when she woke up at night, that the boy had told her he was cold, that the boy sometimes cried but very softly, so as not to disturb. Ernesto remained completely calm about it. I was too, on the surface. But there is something in certain things that small children say that settles in a mother's mind with a persistence that rationality cannot completely dislodge. I began to pay more attention to Lucia's room. It was a normal room, pale pink on the walls, which we had painted before she was born. A bed with railings, a white wardrobe, a shelf with books and toys. The window overlooked an inner courtyard that had little light, but was not gloomy either. The corner that Lucia referred to was the one between the wardrobe wall and the window wall, the darkest part of the room when the light was turned off. A completely empty corner. One night, when Lucia was already asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room looking at that corner for a long moment. The only light was from the hallway, which came in sideways and created elongated shadows on the walls. There was nothing. Of course, there was nothing. I went to bed and tried not to think about it anymore. The real change happened on a Saturday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the first mention of the child. Lucia was playing in her room. I was in the living room folding clothes, with the door to Lucia's room open and the living room door also open, so I could hear her. It was a familiar and comforting sound, the murmur of a 4-year-old girl playing alone, talking to herself or to her toys with that particular narrative logic that young children's games have. Then I heard Lucia stop talking. The silence was sudden. One of those silences that have weight because they replace something that was there a moment before. I stood still with a half-folded t-shirt in my hands, listening. Then I heard Lucia's voice again, but different. It wasn't the voice of play. It was lower, more serious. The tone she uses when she talks to adults or when she says something she considers important. "Why can't you leave?" Lucia said. Silence. "What did you lose?" Silence. "Where did you leave it?" I got up from the couch and walked towards Lucia's room. When I reached the door, she was standing in the center of the room, looking at the corner. Her hands at her sides, her head slightly tilted, with that expression of concentration she had when she was listening to something attentively. "Lucia," I said, She turned towards me. Her expression was completely normal. "Mom, the boy says he lost something and that he can't leave until he finds it." I knelt in front of her. "What did he lose?" Lucia frowned as if consulting internally. "He doesn't know how to call it," she said. "He says it's something of his, something that belonged to him and that someone took away." That night, when Lucia was sleeping and Ernesto and I were in bed, I told him about the conversation. Ernesto listened with that calmness of his that sometimes reassures me and other times drives me crazy. "Children build very elaborate narratives," he said. "They probably heard something, some story, some conversation, and they are processing it through the imaginary friend." "What conversation about a child who lost something and can't leave? It doesn't have to be literal," he said. "Children reinterpret." "Ernesto," she was standing looking at the corner and asking questions to the void. "Children do that all the time." He was technically right. Children do that all the time. But I was there and saw Lucia's face, and there was something in that concentration, in that seriousness with which she listened to the silence of the corner, that didn't feel like a little girl's game with an imaginary friend. It felt like a real conversation. I started to investigate the floor, not dramatically, just with the cautious curiosity of someone who wants to be at peace and knows that the only way to achieve that is to have information. I went to the property registry and looked up the history of the property. The apartment had had 3 previous owners in the last 40 years. The family that sold it to us had owned it for 10 years, before them another family for 15, and before that the original owners, who had it from the construction of the building in the 80s until the early 2000s. Nothing unusual in the registry. I searched the local newspaper's archive, which had a digital version with a search function. It took me a while to find something, but I found it. A brief note from almost 30 years ago. A 6-year-old boy had died in the building. The official cause was a domestic accident. No further details were given, as was customary at that time with news involving minors. The name of the building matched ours. It didn't specify the floor number. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I searched for the name of the family that had lived in the apartment before the ones who sold it to us. It took longer, but I found something. An obituary from several years later, the death of an elderly woman. In the list of survivors, there was a son with a name, and in that woman's biographical note, a line that said she had lost a young son in a tragic accident. It couldn't be proven that it happened in our apartment, but it couldn't be ruled out either. That night I couldn't sleep. The next day I took Lucia to the park, and while she played with other children in the sandbox, I sat on a bench and allowed myself to think about what could be true if I accepted the premise that my daughter seemed to have accepted without difficulty, that there was a child in the corner of her room, a child who could not leave because he had lost something. If there was a child who died in that apartment 30 years ago, what could he have lost? The answer came obliquely, as answers sometimes do when they are not sought directly. It was Lucia who gave it to me that same afternoon while I was bathing her. "Mom, the boy says that what he lost is inside a box." I stopped with the shampoo in my hand. "What box?" "A small box, blue, with a lid that has a drawing of a boat." "And where is the box?" Lucia thought. "He says it was in his room, that someone put it away for him." That night I searched the upstairs thoroughly. I didn't find any blue box with a boat. I looked in all the closets, under the furniture, in the pantry, in the storage room. Nothing. But then I thought of something. When we bought the apartment, the previous family had left some things in the building storage room, in the basement, with the promise of picking them up in a few weeks. Those things were never picked up. We had assumed they had forgotten about them or no longer wanted them, and we had left them there untouched because the storage room was large and we didn't need the space. I went down to the basement. It was a long and dimly lit space, with the characteristic dampness of old building basements. The belongings of the previous family were at the back, against the wall, under a plastic tarp. Cardboard boxes, bags, some small furniture stacked up. I started to go through the boxes. In the third box I opened among folded children's clothes that were clearly not recent. I found a small wooden box, blue, with a lid on which a ship was painted, the paint already chipped away by time. I stood still holding it. It was small, the size of a children's shoebox. The blue paint was that bright blue used for children's things, now worn and dull. The ship on the lid was a simple silhouette, probably painted by an adult hand with craft paint. I opened it. Inside there were childhood things, a small rusty toy car, a glass marble with a blue spiral in the center, a folded photograph, and a pencil drawing on graph paper, the kind of paper that children use in school, with the clumsy and endearing figure that 6 or 7-year-olds draw. A house, 2 big people, 1 small in the center. I unfolded the photograph. It was a family photo. A man, a woman, and a boy about 6 years old sitting between them. The boy looked at the camera with a smile that had the chaotic energy of children at that age. I lifted the box to the floor. I entered Lucia's room. She was playing on the floor with her dolls. I placed the box in the center of the room, in front of the corner. Lucia looked at it. Then she looked at the corner. And something passed over her face that I couldn't precisely describe but recognized. Relief. "Is that the box?" I asked her. Lucia nodded. "It says yes." "And can it go now?" Lucia listened to the silence of the corner for a moment. "She says yes," she repeated. "But thank you." That night, for the first time in weeks, Lucia slept without waking up, and the next day, when I asked her about the boy in the corner, she looked at me with that slightly confused expression that children have when they don't quite understand what you mean. "What boy?" she said. She never mentioned it again. I put the box away. I didn't know what to do with it for a while. I thought about looking for the adult children of the family that sold us the apartment. The ones who, according to the obituary I had found, had lost a younger brother decades ago, and returning it to them. But I couldn't find a way to contact them, and at some point, I decided that maybe it was better for the box to stay in the apartment. That if there was something of that boy that belonged to that place, perhaps it was better for it to stay there. The blue box with the boat is now in the closet of my room, on the highest shelf. I have opened it twice since then, just to check that it's still there, and that everything is still inside. The rusty cart, the marble, the photograph, the drawing. Lucia is now 11 years old and doesn't remember any of this. I asked her once carefully when she was about 8. She looked at me with the expression of someone searching for a memory they can't find. "I don't remember," she said. "Sometimes I also wish I could forget, but that's not how it works." That was all Sophia wanted to share. She told me that writing it down cost her more than she expected, that there are things that seem more real when put into words. If a small child ever told you something you couldn't explain, or if you experienced something similar in your own home, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you while you rested, subscribe to keep receiving more. Take care. We'll talk soon. A listener who signs as Miguel wrote to me a few days ago. He works at night, says he listens to the channel while making his rounds, and what he told me happened to him 2 years ago in an abandoned church on the outskirts of a town in Mexico. He had never told anyone because he knew no one would believe him. If you also have something like that kept inside, you know where to leave it. Now, this is what Miguel experienced the night he entered that place not knowing what was inside. I am a security guard. I have been doing this for 12 years. I work nights, which is when the world empties and buildings show what they are when no one occupies them. I have been in factories, hospitals, deserted shopping malls at 3 in the morning. I have learned to distinguish normal sounds from those that are not, to read the silence of a large place, and not to let myself be carried away by the imagination that fatigue produces in the darkest hours of the morning. I say all this because I want to make it clear that I am not someone who gets scared easily. What I am about to tell does not come from someone who confuses a pipe with a ghost or interprets shadows as presences. I came from this with 12 years of experience and still have no explanation. What happened was 2 years ago, in October. I was in a period between jobs. My contract with the previous company had ended, and I was waiting for a position to open up at the new company where I had been told there were possibilities. During that interim time, an acquaintance told me about a temporary job, taking care of a rural property that was in the process of being sold, an old ranch with some buildings. All that was required was to do night rounds, check that no one entered, and report any novelties. Cash payment, 2 weeks. I accepted. The ranch was about 40 minutes from the nearest town, along a dirt road that in October, with the recent rains, had muddy sections that tested the truck. I arrived the first night when it was already dark. The person in charge of giving me the keys was an older man named Don Filiberto, who was waiting for me at the entrance with a flashlight and an expression that at that moment I interpreted as the weariness of someone who has been in the same place for a long time. He gave me a quick tour of the property. The main house was locked, and it was not my responsibility to enter. There were 2 warehouses, an empty corral, and at the back of the property, separated from the other buildings by a pasture, a church. A church? I said. Of the original family, Don Filiberto said. About 100 years ago, those who lived here built it for their own use. It is no longer used. Does anyone go in there? Don Filiberto looked at me. No one goes in there, he said. And you shouldn't either. Why? Because the roof is in bad condition and it's dangerous, he said. That's all. The tone in which he said it didn't quite match a structural safety explanation, but I didn't ask any more questions. Don Filiberto left, leaving me alone with a spare flashlight, a radio that had intermittent signal, and a thermos of coffee that I appreciated more than I expected. The first nights passed without incident. The ranch at night was what any rural property is at night. Dark, silent except for the sounds of the countryside, with that smell of damp earth and grass that city dwellers find picturesque and those who work in the fields simply ignore. I made my rounds every hour, checked the warehouses, circled the main house, and noted in the notebook they had given me. Everything normal. I avoided the church for the first 4 days, as Don Filiberto had instructed me, but I looked at it every time I passed by the pasture. It was a small building, made of dark stone, with a low bell tower from which the bell had disappeared, leaving only the rusted iron frame. The windows had broken glass, and some were covered with wood from the inside. The front door was made of thick wood with iron fittings that once would have been solid and were now covered in rust and moss. There was nothing visibly threatening about it. It was just an old abandoned building, but there was something about the way the silence behaved around it that was different from the silence of the rest of the property. The ranch at night had sounds, crickets, the wind, some distant animal. Near the church, those sounds faded away, as if the animals kept their distance. On the 5th night, at 1 in the morning, I heard the chanting. I was making my rounds through the pasture, with the flashlight pointing to the ground to avoid sinking my feet in the mud. When I heard it, it was coming from the direction of the church. It was a low chant, with no recognizable melody, more like a rhythmic murmur than a song, like a prayer recited softly by several voices at the same time. I stopped and turned off the flashlight. In the dark, the singing was clearer. It definitely came from the church. There were definitely several voices, and it had that repetitive cadence of something memorized, something that repeats without variation because the purpose is not expression, but repetition itself. I turned on the flashlight and walked toward the church. I reached about 10 meters from the door and stopped. The singing continued from inside, constant, unaltered by my presence, which meant that those inside had either not heard me arrive or did not care. I thought about the rational possibilities. People who had entered to use the space for something, homeless individuals seeking shelter, local youths using the place to gather. All possible, all explainable, all my responsibility to verify. I approached the door and knocked with my fist. "Is anyone there?" I said loudly. "Private property." The singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just the silence of people who stopped singing, the complete silence of the night, without crickets, without wind, without anything. I knocked again. "If there is anyone, I need you to come out." Nothing. I pushed the door. The wood was swollen from the humidity and resisted for a moment, but gave way with a creak that sounded too loud in the silence. I pointed my flashlight at it. The church was small, as I had suspected from the outside. A central nave with rotting wooden benches lined up in 2 rows, several of them broken or overturned. At the front, where there should have been an altar, there was only a stone structure missing pieces. The walls had remnants of paint that had once been religious murals, reduced by time to fragments of colors and shapes without context. There was no one. I searched the space with the flashlight, corner by corner, bench by bench. Nothing. The side sacristy, a small door behind the altar, empty too. The packed dirt floor had no recent footprints that I could distinguish with the flashlight. I went outside, circled the exterior of the church, checking for any back exit where someone might have escaped. There was none. I returned to my patrol point and noted in my notebook. I heard sounds from the church. I checked inside and outside. No news. I didn't sleep well that morning when I got home. The next night I arrived at the ranch with the determination of someone who has decided not to feed what probably has an explanation. I did my rounds. Everything was calm. Around midnight, I sat on the hood of the truck with my thermos of coffee and looked at the sky, which that night was clear and full of stars that can only be seen far from the city. At 2 in the morning, the church door was open. I had closed it the night before. I had to push hard for the swollen wood to give way, and I had left it closed when I left. Now it was wide open, and from where I was, I could see the darkness inside. I approached. No creaking this time. No sound at all. Just the open door and the darkness inside. I entered. Everything was the same as the night before. The broken benches, the walls with the fragmented murals, the incomplete stone altar. But this time I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Perhaps because the night before I was focused on looking for people and not on observing the space. On the floor, in front of the altar, there were marks. They were not recent, that was evident. They were engraved in the packed earth with the same permanence that marks acquire when they are stepped on for a long time. A circle, about 2 meters in diameter, with figures inside that I did not recognize. They were not letters, they were not numbers, they were symbols that had that quality of things designed with a specific purpose, that someone who does not know that purpose cannot decipher. I crouched down to look at them more closely with the flashlight. The circle had dark stains that could have been many things, and that I, at that moment, preferred not to try to identify. I took out my phone and took pictures. Then I stood up, left the church, and called Don Filiberto. He did not answer. It was 2 in the morning and he was probably sleeping, which was completely reasonable. I sent him a message saying that I had found something in the church that I needed him to see. He did not respond that night, nor the next day. On the 3rd night since I had found the marks, Don Filiberto appeared at the ranch without having responded to my messages. He arrived past 11 in an old truck and found me at the meeting point next to the warehouses. "The photos you sent me," he said without greeting. "Did you take them inside the church?" "Yes," I said. "Did you go in the night before as well?" "Yes." I heard voices. I checked that there was no one there. Don Filiberto fell silent for a moment, looking in the direction of the church even though it couldn't be seen from where we were. "There are things you should have told me before accepting this job," I said. "About the church." "If I had told you, you wouldn't have accepted," he said. "Tell me now." Don Filiberto leaned against his truck and crossed his arms. When he spoke, it was with the voice of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally decided to let it go. "The family that founded this ranch over 100 years ago built that church," he said. "At first, it was a normal church for family use, like many that existed on large properties at that time. But the founder's son, the one who inherited the ranch at the beginning of the last century, was a man with interests that did not correspond to what was practiced in a normal church." "What kind of interests?" "The type of interests that make a church become something else," said Don Filiberto. "Night meetings, people coming from afar, rituals that the laborers living on the ranch at that time described in letters that still exist, although the family has always denied them." "What kind of rituals?" Don Filiberto looked directly at me. "Of the kind that involves making deals with what shouldn't be dealt with," he said. "The founder's son was a man who wanted things that honest work couldn't provide, and he found a way to get them. The ranch prospered in a way that its neighbors couldn't explain. It lasted for decades like that. And then the family started to dwindle," he said, "in ways that couldn't be explained well either. Accidents, strange illnesses, people disappearing. The townsfolk said that what the founder had summoned eventually collected what was owed. And the ranch, it changed hands for decades. No one has been able to hold it for more than 10 years. Something always happens. The current owner bought it 3 years ago, thinking it was just superstition, and wants to sell it because in those 3 years, he has lost more than he has gained. And the voices I heard?" Don Filiberto did not respond immediately. "What remained in that church," he finally said, "did not leave when the family left. It's what happens with certain things when they are summoned and not properly dismissed. They stay in the place, and sometimes, especially at a certain time of year, they activate. October. October, he confirmed. I stayed looking at him. And he sent me to take care of this, knowing that? I sent you to take care of the warehouses and the house, he said. The instruction not to enter the church had a purpose. What happens now that I entered? Don Filiberto looked at me with an expression that was not exactly worry, but it wasn't calm either. Probably nothing, he said. Entering is not the same as participating. As long as you haven't touched anything inside or said anything out loud while you were inside, you're probably fine. Probably? He didn't answer. That night I didn't make any more rounds. I stayed in the truck with the engine running and the radio on, looking at the church from the other side of the field. The door was still open, a dark mouth in the dark stone. At 3 a.m, I saw the light. It was a soft, dim light coming through the broken windows of the church. It wasn't the light of a flashlight or a candle. It was a light that pulsed slowly, growing and fading with a rhythm that, if I had to describe it, I would say resembled a breath. And with the light, the singing returned. I didn't get out of the truck. I stayed there, with my hands on the wheel, listening to that rhythmic murmur coming from the other side of the field, while the light pulsed in the broken windows. It lasted almost 20 minutes. Then the light went out and the singing stopped, and silence returned, with the crickets and the wind as if nothing had happened. At dawn, I called the owner of the company that had hired me and told him I was finishing the job. I didn't give any explanations. They paid me for the days worked without asking questions, which told me that I was probably not the first to resign early. I never returned to that ranch. The photos I took were deleted a few days later. It wasn't a rational decision. It was more like instinct. There was something about seeing them again, about having images of those marks on the ground on my phone, that felt like keeping a door ajar, that would be better off closed entirely. In the following months, I had dreams that I won't describe in detail, because some memories hold more power when they aren't given too many words. Dreams with a space I recognized even though it wasn't exactly the church I knew. With a sound I recognized even though it wasn't exactly the song I heard. Over time, the dreams became less frequent. It's been almost a year since I've had any of that kind. But there is something that changed and has not returned to how it was before. When I do night rounds now, anywhere, there is a moment in the route where I stop and listen to the silence before continuing. Not because I expect to hear something, but because I learned that silence has textures, and that certain textures of silence are a warning. And when I find that kind of silence, I do not move forward. I turn around and leave. I still don't know if that makes me better at my job, or just more honest about what exists in certain places at night. I suppose for my purposes, it makes no difference. And with that, what Miguel wanted to share comes to an end. He told me at the end of his message that he hopes the experience helps someone recognize when it's better not to move forward. I believe he is right. If you ever felt that a place was telling you to leave, tell me about it below. I'm interested to know what you did. And if this story accompanied you tonight, subscribe. There are many more testimonies waiting. Sleep well. We'll talk in the next one. A follower of the channel shared with me this experience they lived 2 years ago when they inherited a house in a rural village in Michoacan, Mexico. What they found in the basement and what happened next forced them to sell the property for a fraction of its value and move to another city. If you have inherited properties from deceased relatives and felt that something of theirs or something darker was trapped within those walls, I would love for you to share it below. Now, this is the story of Mateo and the cursed legacy that his grandmother left him without warning. My name is Mateo, and until 2 years ago, I lived a completely normal life in Guadalajara. I worked as an accountant, had a comfortable apartment, and a girlfriend I planned to marry. Everything changed when I received the news that my maternal grandmother, Doña Socorro, had passed away at 93 years old in her house in the village of San Miguel del Monte, in the mountains of Michoacán. I hadn't seen my grandmother in over 10 years. Our family had distanced itself from her after my mother died when I was 15. My grandmother blamed my father for my mother's death, even though it had been cancer, something no one could prevent. The relationship became so toxic that we simply stopped visiting her. The lawyer who handled her will contacted me. I was her only direct heir. She left me her house, her land, and all her belongings. The lawyer mentioned that there was a condition. I had to spend at least 3 nights in the house before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. Your grandmother was very specific about this, the lawyer said over the phone. She said you needed to understand something before deciding. She didn't explain what, just that you had to stay in the house. It seemed strange to me, but I accepted. 3 nights were nothing, and the property was easily worth several million pesos. I could sell it and use the money for a down payment on a house for my girlfriend and me. I drove to San Miguel del Monte on a Friday afternoon. The town was small, perhaps 300 inhabitants, clinging to the slope of a mountain covered with pines and oaks. My grandmother's house was on the outskirts, isolated from the town by a 2-kilometer dirt road. It was an old construction of adobe and stone, 2 stories high, with a red tile roof. The gardens were neglected, overrun with weeds. The windows had closed wooden shutters, giving the house a blind and closed appearance. I used the key that the lawyer had given me to open the front door. The interior smelled musty, of years of solitude and accumulated dust. The furniture was covered with white sheets, like ghosts of a past life. I explored the ground floor. There was a spacious room with a fireplace, an old kitchen with a wood stove, a formal dining room that probably hadn't been used in decades. Everything was frozen in time, as if my grandmother had stopped making changes to the house at some point in the 70s. I went up to the second floor. There were 3 bedrooms. I chose the one that seemed to have been the guest room. I didn't want to sleep in my grandmother's room. The bedroom had a single bed with a mattress that smelled of dampness, a carved wooden wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the dark woods surrounding the property. After settling in, I decided to explore the rest of the house while there was still light. It was then that I found the basement door, hidden behind a heavy pantry in the kitchen. The door was locked with an old padlock, but the key was hanging on a hook right next to it, as if my grandmother wanted it to be found. On the door, carved into the wood, were words in what seemed to be Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the region. I couldn't read them, but something about them made me uncomfortable. I opened the padlock and the door swung inward, revealing stone stairs that descended into darkness. A smell rose from below. Incense, copal, and something organic that I couldn't identify. I used my phone's flashlight to light the way as I went down. The stairs were steep and worn from use. The stone walls were damp, covered in moss in some places. The basement was larger than expected, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house, and what it contained made me stop dead in my tracks. It was not an ordinary basement. It was an altar, a complete ceremonial space dedicated to something that clearly was not the Catholicism that my grandmother publicly professed. In the center, there was a long table covered with a black tablecloth. On it, dozens of candles of different colors, most consumed to mere puddles of wax. There were clay figurines representing figures I did not recognize, some human, others mixing human and animal traits. There were jars filled with herbs, dark liquids, powders of strange colors, and on the back wall, painted directly on the stone, there was a huge mural. It depicted a female figure surrounded by snakes, holding something that looked like a bleeding heart in one hand and a skull in the other. Her eyes were open too wide. Her mouth smiled with too many teeth. Below the mural were books, ancient grimoires, some in Spanish, others in Nahuatl, one in what appeared to be Latin. I leafed through them with trembling hands. They were books of magic, of rituals, of invocations to entities that the church would have considered demonic. My grandmother had been a witch, a practitioner of black magic combining folk Catholicism, pre-Hispanic indigenous traditions, and something darker that I could not fully identify. And in one of the books, I found pages marked with my name, not just my name, but dates, my birth, my mother's death, my college graduation. Every important event in my life was documented along with symbols and annotations in the margins. There was a large envelope on the altar table with my name written in my grandmother's shaky handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a letter and an object wrapped in black cloth. The letter said, "Mateo, my dear grandson, if you are reading this, it means you have finally found my true chapel, the place where I have worked for over 70 years. I know your father raised you to be skeptical, not to believe in these things. But you need to understand the truth about our family, about your mother, and about the price I have paid to keep you alive. When your mother fell ill with cancer, I did what any desperate mother would do. I sought power beyond what the doctors could offer. I found that power in the ancient traditions of our ancestors, in the pacts that one can make when willing to pay the price. I made a deal with the lords of the mountain, the ancient entities that have inhabited these mountains since before the Spaniards arrived. I offered them sacrifice and service in exchange for healing your mother. But the lords are deceitful. Yes, they cured her cancer technically, but they transferred it, not back to her, but to you. You were supposed to have died from that cancer at 16. When I realized the deception, I made another pact, a darker pact. I offered my own life, artificially extended through rituals, as collateral. As long as I lived and continued the rituals of service, you would live free from the disease. But now I am dead, and the pact needs to be renewed or terminated. The wrapped object is the stone of the covenant. It is the physical anchor of the agreement between our family and the lords. If you destroy it, the covenant will break, and the cancer you were meant to have at 16 will catch up with you. You will die in weeks. If you keep it and learn the rituals in the books I have left, you can continue the covenant. But it comes at a price. The lords demand service, rituals every new moon, specific offerings, and every 5 years, a greater sacrifice. I do not expect you to forgive me for binding you to this without your knowledge, but I do not regret it either. You are my blood, and I would do anything to keep you alive. The choice is now yours. I asked for 3 nights because that is how long it takes the lords to present themselves once the guardian of the covenant has died. They will come for you before dawn on the 3rd day. You must decide before then. With eternal love and infinite apologies, your grandmother Socorro. My hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the letter. I unwrapped the object. It was a stone the size of my fist, black as obsidian but with red veins that seemed to pulse with their own light. It was warm to the touch, and when my fingers touched it, I felt something, a heartbeat, as if the stone were alive. I dropped the stone as if it burned and ran up from the basement. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. My grandmother had been senile in the end, clearly. This was just the fantasies of an old woman who had lost touch with reality. But then I remembered something. When I was 16, just after my mother died, I became seriously ill. The doctors couldn't diagnose what was wrong. High fever, weight loss, unbearable pain. They ran all kinds of tests, including full scans looking for cancer. They found nothing, and after 3 weeks the symptoms simply disappeared. The doctors called it a severe viral infection that had run its course, but they never identified what virus. Could it have been? No, I couldn't afford to believe in this. I spent the first night in the house awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, trying to rationalize what I had found. In the morning, I drove to town to talk to people who might have known my grandmother. What I discovered chilled my blood. Everyone in the village knew what my grandmother was. They called her the healer, but the title came with fear, mixed with respect. She had cured diseases, yes, but she had also cursed people. She had performed rituals that people whispered about but never spoke of directly, and everyone mentioned the lords of the mountain. It was a local belief that in the mountains surrounding the village lived ancient entities, neither gods nor demons exactly, but something in between. Entities that had been revered by pre-Hispanic cultures and had never really left. Your grandmother was the only one who could communicate with them, an old man told me in the only cafe in the village. She made pacts on behalf of others. She always warned that there was a price, but desperate people do not heed warnings. What kind of price? I asked. The old man looked at me with tired eyes. It depends on the pact. Sometimes it's continuous service, sometimes it's sacrifice. It's always more than what people expect to pay. I returned home more confused and scared than before. Part of me just wanted to leave, drive back to Guadalajara, forget all of this. But my grandmother's letter obsessed me. What if it was true? What if I really had latent cancer that only the rituals had contained? The second night was worse than the first. I heard things. Movement in the woods around the house. Scratches on the outside walls. And from the basement, I could swear I heard voices singing in that ancient language I didn't understand. At midnight, I forced myself to go down to the basement again. I needed to understand. My grandmother's books were all there. I started reading them, using my cell phone to translate the parts in Nahuatl. What I found was a story of generations. My grandmother had not been the first. Our family had been involved with the Lords of the Mountain for at least 5 generations. Each guardian of the pact learned the rituals and passed them on to the next. But my mother had broken the cycle. She had refused to learn the rituals, married my father, and moved far away. And when she fell ill, my grandmother had brought her back to this basement, to this altar, and had renewed the pact by force. The details of what my grandmother had sacrificed over the years were meticulously documented. Animals at first, then more valuable things, years of her own life, precious memories that she literally forgot after offering them, skills that she lost permanently, and every 5 years the greater sacrifice. I found records of 3 of these sacrifices. They did not specify what exactly she had sacrificed, only that after each one, she had been physically ill for weeks and had visibly aged years in days. The last major sacrifice had been 6 years ago. The next would have been due in another year, but my grandmother had died before, passing the responsibility to me. At dawn on the 3rd day, I was exhausted but still awake. I had made a decision. I would destroy the stone, break the pact. If I truly had cancer, I would rather face it with modern medicine than bind myself to serve dark entities for the rest of my life. I took the stone from the altar and carried it outside. I found a large rock and prepared to crush it. But the moment I lifted the stone above my head, I felt something. A sharp pain in my chest, then in my stomach, then spreading throughout my body like liquid fire running through my veins. I fell to the ground, the packed stone rolling out of my hands. The pain was unbearable, as if every cell in my body was being consumed from the inside. And then I saw them, emerging from the forest. 3 figures. They were not completely solid. They were like 3-dimensional shadows, shapes that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. They were vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin, with limbs extending in impossible proportions. The grandson of Socorro, one said, her voice resonating directly in my mind. The last of the line. The pact must continue or it must end. Choose now. I don't want this, I managed to say between waves of pain. Then die. Another of the figures replied. The illness that your grandmother contained for 22 years will be unleashed. You will have perhaps 2 weeks before your body completely fails. Oh, said the 3rd figure. Accept the pact, learn the rituals, serve as your grandmother served, and you will live a long life with power that few mortals know. The pain intensified. I could feel something growing inside me, cells multiplying out of control exactly like the cancer that had killed my mother. What is the real price? I asked. Continuous service, replied the 1st figure. Rituals every new moon, offerings of life energy, yours and that of others seeking our favor, and every 5 years you must bring us a soul, someone who willingly agrees to serve in your place for a period. Their service feeds the pact for another 5 years. What happens to those souls? They are transformed. They become part of us, eternal servants in the realm between worlds. It is not death, but it is not life as you know it either. I saw my future unfolding before me in 2 paths. In one, I rejected this and died painfully within weeks. In the other, I accepted and became what my grandmother had been, a witch in service of forces I did not fully understand, manipulating the life and death of others to maintain a corrupt pact. And I made the most cowardly and selfish decision of my life. I accept, I whispered. Immediately, the pain disappeared. The cancer that had been growing stopped, reversed, vanished as if it had never existed. I felt stronger, more alive than I had been in years. The figures approached. One of them extended what could be called a hand. I took it and felt energy flowing from them to me. Knowledge. The rituals were implanted in my mind like memories I had always had. The pact is renewed, they said in unison. You have 5 years until the first major sacrifice. Use that time wisely. Learn the rituals well. And remember, trying to break the pact after accepting it results in consequences worse than mere death. They faded back into the forest, leaving me alone in my grandmother's garden at dawn. That was 2 years ago. I have performed the rituals every new moon. I have used the knowledge I inherited to heal some, to curse others who have offended me. I permanently moved to my grandmother's house away from my previous life in Guadalajara. My girlfriend broke up with me when I couldn't explain why I suddenly needed to live in a remote mountain village. I left my job as an accountant. Now I am the healer of the village, just as my grandmother was the healer. And in 3 more years, I will have to make my first major sacrifice. I will have to find someone willing to accept an offer that sounds too good to be true, who will voluntarily sign their soul to serve the lords of the mountain. I have already started identifying potential candidates. Desperate people, sick people, people who believe they have nothing to lose. It's easier than you would think. Desperation makes people accept terms they would never consider under normal circumstances. I hate myself for what I have become, but I would hate myself more for being dead. So I carry on. I perform the rituals. I learn more from my grandmother's books. And I prepare for the day when I will have to look someone in the eyes and convince them to give up their soul to extend my own cursed pact. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother struggled with the same guilt, if each of the guardians of the pact before me felt this same weight. The books do not say. They only document the rituals, the sacrifices, the dates. Nothing about how they felt doing it. The house is now truly mine. I partially remodeled it, updating the kitchen and bathrooms. But the basement remains exactly as my grandmother left it. It is my chapel now, the place where I kneel before the mural of the dark goddess and sing in ancient tongues under the new moon. And every night when the forest darkens and I hear movement among the trees, I know that the lords of the mountain are watching, ensuring that I fulfill my part of the pact, waiting for the next sacrifice I owe them. 3 more years, just 3 years before I have to completely destroy the life and soul of another person to save my own. And I will, because I am a coward, because I value my life more than my morality. Because once you accept the pact, there is no true way out except forward, deeper into the darkness. My grandmother knew this. That's why she left me the letter, the stone, the house. She wasn't giving me a real choice. She was making sure that the family pact continued, that another generation served the lords of the mountain. And it worked. I am the guardian of the pact now. And in some future, if I have children, one of them will inherit this basement, these books, this pulsating stone that beats like a dark heart. The cycle continues, as it has continued for 5 generations. As it will continue as long as there is someone of our blood willing to sacrifice their humanity for a few more years of life. That is the true price of the pact, not just the rituals or the occasional sacrifices. It is what makes you yourself, how it transforms you from a person into a tool, from human into a conduit for forces that should not be served. My grandmother lived to 93. If I continue the pact faithfully, I might too. Decades more of artificially extended life, bought with the souls of others. Is it worth it? Ask me in 3 years, after the first major sacrifice. Ask me if I can still look at myself in the mirror after condemning someone to eternal servitude. But I probably already know the answer. Because if my grandmother could do it 5 times and the guardians before her did it dozens of times more, then I can too. Because in the end, we are all weaker than we think. We are all capable of greater darkness than we admit. And all of us, when we face our own mortality, discover exactly how much we are willing to sacrifice of ourselves and others to keep living one more day. That was Mateo's testimony. He contacted me a month ago, and by the date, I estimate he has about a year left before his first major sacrifice. I don't know if he will actually do it or if he will find another way out. If you have ever found yourself caught in an impossible decision where all the options seem terrible, share it in the comments. Sometimes the choices we make in moments of fear define us more than we would like to admit. Rest in peace, and see you in the next story.